Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Rebecca Friedman, the founding director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at Florida International University here in Miami, FIU's hub for all things humanities. Today, we've teamed up with the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs and the Shepard K. Broad Distinguished Lecture Series to host a conversation between Peter Slevin and Michael Bustamante. Peter is a contributing writer to The New Yorker based in Chicago and focusing on politics. He teaches at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism and is the author of Michelle Obama, A Life. And Michael is my dear colleague here in the history department at FIU, whose area of focus is revolutionary Cuba. He's the author of The Revolution from Within, Cuba 1959 to 1980, which he edited with Jennifer Lambe, and the forthcoming, can't wait for this, Cuban Memory Wars, Retrospective Politics and Revolution and Exile, due out in March 2021. Much better year than this one. This panel was inspired by Peter's New Yorker piece on the many tangled American definitions of socialism. In this piece, among many other things that Peter confronts, he describes the political outlook of the only socialist on the American center stage, Bernie Sanders, and his Sanders-style socialism. Sanders, Peters tells us, called his own politics, quote, the unfinished business of the New Deal. It includes an economic bill of rights, which indicates a living wage, healthcare, a secure retirement, and a clean environment. Socialism, too, Peter tells us that Sanders warned, in the words of Harry Truman in 1952, is the epithet they have hurled at every advance that people have made in the last 20 years. Socialism is what they call social security. Socialism is what they call farm support. Socialism is what they call bank deposit insurance. Socialism is what they call the growth of free and independent labor. Socialism is their name for almost everything that helps all of the people. And still now, decades after Truman and decades after the end of the Cold War, months after the presidential political demise of Sanders, the very echo of the S word makes Americans run the other way. And as an aside, as I was thinking about this panel, somehow leveling fascism or authoritarianism at our sitting president does not have the same impact. Hashtag Timothy Snyder. What is it about socialism in the American context? What do people mean when they utter the word or when they react to it? Why is it so visceral? Of course, it's all contextual. The reactions have to do, of course, with the shadow of the Cold War and something buried deep inside of American culture that predates the rise of the Eastern Bloc and Fidel Castro and the like. The reaction is at least as emotive as it is pragmatic. And let's face it, it works. It works when Kamala Harris is called a communist or Biden accused of being socialist leaning. The news tells us it is somehow true, whatever that means. It is the deep place of individualism in the American psyche? A cynic might suggest, including lack of care for those less fortunate. Is it the high politics of the Cold War in nations that have had or have communist leaders? So is it geopolitics? How can we unpack this without becoming elitist snobs who hurl insults at those who understand less than we do? We could think about the rise of socialism in 19th century Europe, its utopian guise focused on living arrangements and collectives and communes rather than competitive enterprise and private property. Or late 19th century renditions in the form of Marx and Engels, where the people own the means of production and the proletariat are rising up against the bourgeoisie. Or each according to his own or her own ability versus pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps. Or in the 1920s Soviet version, in theory, of the state taking over responsibilities, such as feeding the population in cafeterias, raising children, civil marriage, easy divorce, novel in those days, rather than church sanctioned. Education too, all to unburden women of these duties so that they could study and work and live unfettered by domestic burdens. And that those ideas were implemented piecemeal at best and briefly, and also, by the way, named communism. Or, of course, more familiar to many these days, the Stalin-style brutality of the 30s under the name of communism, where people were purged for their ideas and even less than that. I will leave what comes after to my wonderful colleagues today, but allow me to begin with a simple question. How do each of you after you give your opening statements, of course, how do each of you imagine the American public understands the meaning of socialism, and why, oh why, is its very echo so powerful even today? Thank you. And I think we will start with Peter to give your opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and great to see you, Michael. Boy, the S word indeed, and you've left us with plenty to chew over. It's remarkable, honestly, how pungent the term has been this time around. And I thought I would start by just talking a little bit about what I've seen in traveling around to a number of different states, including very recently, Wisconsin, and been down in North Carolina, and I've been reporting in Arizona. And what you hear on the Republican side is this idea that Biden is a great danger. He is a socialist, or we're headed towards socialism. At 1:27 this very morning, a fundraising email dropped into my account, and it came from the Trump campaign and the Republican National Committee. The subject line was this: "I am not intimidated by these radical socialists." And the tone of the email was as classy as ever, what we've come to expect from this president and his team. He referred to Joe Biden, the former vice president of the United States, as Sleepy Joe. He referred to Kamala Harris, senator from California, elected in a state with 40 million residents, as phony Kamala. The content was as nonsensical as ever, with Biden and Harris supposedly being, quote, radical socialist, but also somehow liberal mega donors, these are their terms, are coming up with $100 million for their campaign. If we follow the logic or the illogic, we have rich Democrats who are going to vote for radical socialism, and the leader who will force this radical restructuring of American society is supposedly so hapless and forgetful that Trump brands him as sleepy. None of it makes sense, of course, but that's not the point. I think what the Trump campaign knows, and they know this from polls, they know it from focus groups, is that policies and candidates who are branded as socialists are not at all popular among the Republican base that Trump needs to get elected. And I think that's why the word socialism appears over and over again in Trump's campaign marketing. On October 16th, for example, it was, quote, socialist nightmare versus American dream. On August 30th, it was Donald Trump Jr. warning that, quote, Joe Biden and the radical left will do whatever it takes to defeat my father and turn our country into a socialist nightmare. At the Republican National Convention, Trump Sr., the president of the United States, said, this election will decide whether we save the American dream or whether we allow a socialist agenda to demolish our cherished destiny. And lest we forget, other candidates are saying the same thing, notably Joni Ernst, who's facing a difficult re-election in her Senate campaign in Iowa. And the warning has a history. It was Ronald Reagan in 1961 who warned darkly, we will awake to find that we have socialism. One of these days, you and I are going to spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in America when men were free. What was the peril that he thought would be so bad? Medicare. And everyone knows that 50 years after Medicare passed in 2015, it was supremely popular. 70 million Americans are on Medicare, and most polls show about 75% popularity for this socialist idea. You may remember the voter who said, I think it was during the fight over the Affordable Care Act in around 2010, the voter who said, now you just get your government hands off of my Medicare. So what's going on here? And as Rebecca said, what does socialism even mean to voters? As far as the politics of it, when it comes to the Trump campaign, the answer, it seems, is that socialism as a term means whatever the Trump campaign decides that it means. Trump never defines it. It's just something that would be terrible. You know, it's like that other term that he co-opted and turned into a slur, fake news. Fake news isn't content that is fake or propaganda, as its original meaning suggested. In fact, it's just content he doesn't like. But if you say it enough, Trump has found, it delegitimizes journalists. And the same with socialism. If you say it often enough, it becomes a fact, at least among Trump's supporters. The idea is a pretty simple equation. Socialism is bad. Biden, Harris, and the Democrats are socialist, therefore Biden and the Democrats are bad. It's Orwellian. It's like that scene in Animal Farm where the animals chant, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. You know, I've been spending a lot of time in Wisconsin. A few weeks ago, I went to a Biden event in Manitowoc, about 90 miles north of Milwaukee. And there were Trump supporters there too. And I always like to see the signs that people are carrying. And one carried a homemade poster that said, "A vote for Biden equals socialism." And the other day, as Rebecca said, Trump even called Kamala Harris a communist. And you want to say, huh? How can that even be? Socialism is still marked by strong connotations and conflicting definitions in the United States. For decades, many Americans defined it in terms of the Cold War, equating the term with state control of the economy and more often than not authoritarian rule. But in recent trips to Wisconsin and elsewhere, as I spoke with dozens of voters and political figures, it was clear from the conversations that the term conjures dramatically different images, from decency to social decay. Some people equate socialism with a fair-minded social contract, largely underwritten by a market economy, while others do think of Stalin's Soviet Union, or more recently, Venezuela, where the late Hugo Chavez and the current leader Maduro ran a prospering economy into the ground under socialism's banner. Its importance to the campaign seems real. Otherwise, we wouldn't see the Trump campaign using the term as often as they do, and boy, do they use it all the time. I spoke last year with Patrick Murray. He's a pollster in New Jersey, and he directs the respected Monmouth University poll. He predicted ahead of time that understanding this word, as he put it, is going to be a significant part of the 2020 landscape. And in his polls, he too finds a series of contradictions. A survey published in May 2019 found that only 29% of Americans consider socialism compatible with American values. And yet 50% believe socialism is, quote, a way to make things fairer to working people, for working people. And that's the thing. There are no agreed definitions of socialism. And any attempt at annotation risks proving the campaign adage that if you're explaining, you're losing, something that I think Bernie Sanders found out. As Murray put it, people don't vote on objective definitions. They vote on their visceral reaction to what they think the term means. And he sees a divide by age and political party. Only 6% of Democrats and independents who lean Democratic actually expressed negative opinions about socialism in a poll that he did last year. 76% of self-identified Republicans did have negative feelings about socialism. His view is that we're going to lose, we're going to see the negative use of socialism, but it's going to lose its power over time. And Gallup tried to figure this out too. They asked what socialism means. The answers were all over the map. The most common responses, at 23%, fell into the category of no opinion or equal standing for everybody, all equal in rights, equal in distribution. The next most common answer, at 17%, was government ownership or control. And then there were the 6% who thought socialism meant, quote, talking to people, being social, social media, talking to people. As Rebecca said, Senator Sanders last year, when his campaign was still alive, did go back and quote Harry Truman and say his great line that socialism is the epithet they've hurled at every advance that people have made in the last 20 years. Sanders delivered a speech last year that essentially equated democratic socialism with a kind of unthreatening egalitarianism in the spirit of FDR and Martin Luther King. He called it the unfinished business of the New Deal, and he recited an economic bill of rights, as he called it, that included the right to a living wage, healthcare, a secure environment, and a secure retirement and a clean environment. Maybe it'd be interesting to share just a bit as I wrap up with my conversations with voters about this very question that Rebecca is asking. I spoke with a pharmacist from Missouri. I was in Milwaukee, and she said it's about sharing the wealth, but not taking away from others. Somebody else said it's looking at the greater good. And yet somebody else said, he manages an appliance store. He said socialism would strip away individual rights. We have the concept of freedom and liberty that are so powerful in the Republican message. He said, look what's happening in New York. You can't even supersize your sodas because they think we're too stupid to make our own choices. I spoke with a man who had served in the Marines in Vietnam. He's 74 years old. He works with special education students, and he still wears his Marine Corps dog tags around his neck. He said, socialism's not the answer. It takes away the American spirit of working for something. And he gave me an example. He said, if I gave you a brand new Corvette, free, you don't owe me a penny. I wondered what you'd think of that Corvette. You didn't work 1 second for it. Socialism is government giving it to you, so you squander it. And I found other people who said the same thing, that socialism stagnates a country, which is a point that Trump makes, argues at least all the time. One man said, I'm all for capitalism. It weeds out what doesn't work. And then finally, I spoke with a corporate travel consultant who was riding his Harley at the Memorial Day parade last year in Milwaukee. His father was a city worker. His mother worked for a company that supplied leather seats to Harley Davidson. And he's frustrated by the demonization of socialism. He said, as a practical matter, as a political matter, we've got to talk about the common good. When you have greed, no one comes out a winner except those on top. He's no Trump fan, but he also thinks Democrats need to tread carefully when it comes to the word, focus on policies and not the labels. He said, find other ways to talk about it. People hear certain words and they shut down completely. And I think if nothing else, that gives the Democrats kind of a way to deal with it, because the policies themselves are actually reasonably popular, but boy, they're demonized by the President of the United States. So let me leave it there. And we can go to questions whenever Rebecca says, and I'm looking forward to hearing Michael's story.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you so much. A lot to chew on. We'll just turn to Michael then to questions. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Peter. It's great to be with you both for this, I think, important conversation. Speaking from a South Florida vantage point, it feels like this conversation is sort of a bit of good trouble to get into these days. And so what I thought I'd do in that spirit is actually tackle this debate or share my reflections on it from the vantage point of someone who studies the history of Cuban America most directly, but also lives and works in Miami and has seen this issue play out in the present electoral context in a place where I think the word has, a particular weight, right? If socialism is sort of caught up with all the kinds of baggage that Rebecca was outlining at the beginning, I think in South Florida, it registers in particular ways based on the experiences of the people who live here, right? So I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to say something about kind of how I see the word being invoked in the South Florida context in particular. And I want to share some thoughts and observations and maybe critiques about, or some doubts, I guess, about how I have seen the Democrats kind of try to respond to it, right? Because foreshadowing, I don't think they've quite figured it out, even though I think Peter was gesturing towards some solid ideas. So the poster, I think, for this event, or the marketing copy, ironically, for an event on socialism, perhaps, asked, what's in a word? And I think in South Florida, there's a lot in that word. Socialism for a community that is composed or comprised of, in particular, large immigrant populations from places like Cuba, increasingly from Venezuela. And even when we're talking about countries that haven't been under the leadership of governments that exist under the banner of socialism, thinking back to the Cold War, were fronts of the Latin American Cold War and trying to keep socialism out or trying to prevent them from becoming the proverbial new Cuba, right? You think about the growing Brazilian community here, particularly in a moment where Jair Bolsonaro is the president. You can think about the Colombian community, Colombia having a history of fighting off multiple Marxist-inspired insurgencies over decades, right? So this word has there's very particular baggage, I think in South Florida. It has ingrained associations. It conjures difficult memories. I think for many, and I'm thinking most of sort of the Cuban experience, which is the one I know best, to invoke the word socialism is to invoke the specter of that thing or that ideology or that system, kind of vaguely defined, that was the reason ultimately that you decided to leave the place of your birth, right? And so, and I think it's you know, it's very much in line with what Rebecca was saying. It's almost visceral, but it's also grounded in particular experiences and memories. So I think what some progressive Democrats have been trying to do over the last few years, and you know, Bernie Sanders is not the only one, of trying to kind of rediscover a particularly American tradition of socialism, or a particularly American way of defining that term. And there certainly is that tradition. I mean, go back to Eugene V. Debs, for example. That challenge is complicated and compounded in South Florida by the particularity of these immigrant and sort of diasporic experiences and memories, right? And also is compounded by the fact that in many respects, you know, South Florida is this very strange bubble, right? I think we've all heard the jokes, especially in Miami, that Miami is in the United States, but not entirely of the United States. The old bumper stickers that were printed in the 70s as a sign of nativism at the time toward the growing Latino and Caribbean populations, you know, will the last American to leave Miami-Dade please take the flag, right? You know, the proverbial outmigration of sort of the old white Anglo Miami community to Broward. So Miami, I think because of that kind of bubble effect, because of the particular ecosystem of, say, Spanish language media that often is very disconnected, it seems to me, from a kind of mainstream media in the United States, these debates are happening in ways that that intersect with the broader politics of the United States in this electoral cycle, but are also kind of separate from it. And it also means that, particularly for immigrant communities that you know, have relatively little time, let's say, in the United States, or sort of the most recent members of those immigrant communities, you know, when Bernie Sanders talks about someone like Eugene Debs as a point of inspiration for sort of defining his kind of vision of socialism, I mean, they might as well be speaking Martian, right? Because actually the knowledge of US history doesn't go that far back, right? So I think that's some of the challenge of what progressive Democrats are faced with. And I also think that, you know, we have to acknowledge that during the course of the primary campaign, you know, there were definitely some unforced errors. You know, Bernie Sanders, I forget at what debate it was, there was this big scandal when he praised the literacy campaign in revolutionary Cuba in 1961. And for him, he seemed kind of mind-boggled as to why this would be sort of a flashpoint of controversy. And in a certain sense, I understand him. There was a need to give people literacy in Cuba, the start of the Cuban Revolution, particularly in rural areas. And it did achieve good in that respect, albeit teaching people to read basically at a first grade level just to start. But for people that experience that moment, you know, that campaign also conjures all kinds of memories. It conjures the memories of those literacy booklets also being highly politicized, right? Of learning to read by learning to sort of recite the name of Fidel Castro, right? F is for Fidel, literally said some of the literacy manuals. And so, you know, it was as if Bernie Sanders had kind of walked into this easily avoidable mess, right? And sort of, it was a kind of a triggering moment for South Florida. And we can debate back and forth about, you know, whether Bernie Sanders had a point or not, but the point was that it was a political unforced error, I think, from, you know, I would say. But for me, that doesn't excuse, in my view, the way that, you know, the word socialism is being thrown around and abused and misused on the other side of the aisle in the context of this election in ways that really boggle the mind. And as Peter rightly says, this is not new in American politics. It's not new in South Florida politics either, right? To brand your enemy as suspicious or as comunista, as is happening today. To that long list that Truman gave in that quote of the things that have been branded as socialist when they were really just social advances, you know, you could add segregation or desegregation, I should say, right? The civil rights struggle was itself deemed socialist in its day. So this kind of scare tactic, in a way, Red Scare, whatever you want to call it, is not new. And yet I have been very surprised by, again, sort of the intensity that it is with which it is showing up in this electoral cycle. It feels like in Miami, at least, we're kind of back to some of the most strident rhetoric of the Cold War era, right? And I think the turnaround has been particularly disorienting, because if we go back to 2008, 2012 to think about, Cuban voters in Miami-Dade County, that was a time when all the polls were showing that more and more Cuban voters in Miami-Dade County were pretty evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. Barack Obama did better than any Democrat, had done, certainly in living memory. And yet the most recent polling just shows a sharp reversal, right? And the socialism attack line has been, definitely a part of that. So how is socialism being used? And I wanted to just share a couple of images, if I can. Hopefully everyone is seeing that now. I was driving on I-95 last week between Palm Beach County, Florida, and Miami-Dade. These are not actual photos that I took on my drive. That would have been irresponsible of me. But I was on Google Images today trying to find sort of like things very much like the things that I saw, right? Billboards that exist in Miami-Dade County, but also in Broward, also in Palm Beach County. You see things like this. This happens to be from Ocala, Florida, but I think I pretty much saw the same thing. You see this I'm pretty sure is from Miami-Dade County, or maybe just north in Broward. This is from Palm Beach County, although I saw multiple versions of this along, the 90-mile or so drive. And I think most interestingly, this is from Texas, right? But I couldn't find the Florida version of this, but there is a Florida version of it, different font. And so I can't say for certain if the same people that are behind this are behind the one that I saw. But this line, "Don't vote for what you fled," right? That is a line that I saw on at least 2 or 3 billboards along I-95 in South Florida. And to me, that's unmistakable, right? What that's referencing. That's referencing people's, the places from which they came, right? And one has to point out the irony of invoking kind of a story of an immigrant plight on behalf of an administration that has, to put it mildly, not been favorable to those that are seeking asylum, including people seeking asylum from Cuba and Venezuela, right? This is just a kind of a taste of how it's being invoked. Another thing that I saw recently, I was on the line to drop my son off at daycare, and one of the other dads, I'm new at the daycare, so I don't know him yet, maybe that's a good thing, had this shirt that said, "Capitalism makes, socialism takes," right? And we can debate all day long whether the implementation of Marx's ideas by different governments over history amounted to any kind of good, right? But one thing that we can extract from Marx is actually a lesson about the surplus value of labor and how that works in capitalism. So actually capitalism, the function of capitalism, in part, it does make, but it also takes, it extracts value, right? So it just speaks to a kind of impoverished, I think, understanding of what these terms even mean. They are more specters of one's imagination, it seems to me, than real. Maybe I should revise that, because they're kind of specters of one's imagination, but also grounded, as I said, in these particular experiences. When in fact, what's really being talked about in the United States is not sort of state control of the economy. It's about redefining the social contract in one way or another. And again, I think that maybe it's a politically unwise to use the term socialism per se, but that's what's being talked about. So let me just conclude by, I want to point out a few ironies about the South Florida context in this debate, and then say something about how the Democrats have, I think, been responding. Some of the ironies about the South Florida context are that, this is a context, when you look at the political economy in South Florida, that this place should be ripe for Bernie bros and the like, right? This is a largely service-based economy where wages are depressed. One of the most unequal sort of major metropolitan areas in the United States. This all we know. Enrollment for Obamacare in South Florida is through the roof. I believe I'm correct in stating that South Florida and Miami-Dade County in particular have some of the highest rates of Obamacare enrollment in the country. And yet this is also, it seems to me, for the Trump campaign, the front lines of sort of the anti-socialism attack in Florida. And it's the same people, right? You could very easily find someone who is an Obamacare enrollee and who is sort of supporting Trump's anti-socialism message. So some of those contradictions are stunning, and I don't think Democrats have figured out a way to sort of pierce through that sufficiently, right? At least among certain communities down here. We do have to remember that Miami-Dade County does still vote Democrat, but it is not thanks per se to the overwhelming votes of, say, Cuban Americans or increasingly Venezuelan Americans. And so how have Democrats tried to respond to this in the South Florida context? And I'll end here. My concern is that I've seen a few ways that Democrats have responded that I fear what they do is they reinforce the bad faith attack line rather in an effort to reject it, right? I think one basic lesson of political messaging that some friends who are more skilled in that business than me is that when you have a bad faith attack, you don't echo the terms of that attack to respond. You sort of, you draw people's attention to a more positive message that you want them to focus on. And so when I have seen Democrats saying, no, we're not socialist. When I've seen Joe Biden at a recent campaign event say, I'm the guy who beat the socialist, right? I also think, well, even in a place like South Florida, you need the Bernie Sanders supporters if this is such a tight margins game. And I've also seen Democrats at times try to, in a sense, out anti-socialism, the anti-socialists, in a sense, right? The counter attack from Democrats has been, if socialist is sort of coterminous, not just with state control of the economy, but authoritarianism, it is the Trump administration that is in fact the authoritarian party here. And so even in Miami, there was this billboard recently that featured Trump's face with Hugo Chavez's eyes sort of superimposed. There's another billboard that I think I actually have here. If I can just go back to these slides really quickly. This was put up, right? Insinuating that is the GOP is most like the old USSR. I mean, this is a pretty stunning image. But again, my sense from the evidence and talking to people who have kind of worked on focus groups with different voter groups is that this attack line doesn't work. This may reinforce a certain kind of part of the Democratic base in South Florida, but if you're trying to convince the Trump voters or the Trump curious voter to kind of come to your side, you're actually, by labeling Trump the very thing that they don't identify with, you're alienating them more, right? And so this, I think, speaks to some of the struggles that Democrats have faced to try to get through here. And if I could just mention one last thing in closing, I think in the South Florida context, and maybe nationally, I'm not sure, but I am sure in the South Florida context, another important subtext of this kind of anti-socialism rhetoric, particularly lately, has had to do with the debate over race relations in the United States, right? In the wake of George Floyd, in the wake of the resurgence again this past year of the Black Lives Matter movement, Hispanic media in the United States has been flooded with all kinds of coverage of those movements that don't resemble anything like impartial or fair coverage. Tim Padgett, a local reporter for WLRN, our NPR affiliate, did a good report a couple of weeks back about just the amount of misinformation that's circulating about Black Lives Matter as sort of the spearhead of a global socialist conspiracy. And this, I think, also speaks to what I was getting at before, the lack of familiarity and deep historical knowledge about the history of race relations in this country and the present of race relations in this country, and sort of the bubble effect of living in certain immigrant communities in Miami. So I wouldn't take race out of this equation entirely. It's a little bit separate from the main way that you see the socialism attack appear, but for me, it's definitely part of the equation. And there's an anxiety, and Miami is a place where being Hispanic means you're in the white majority effectively, right? So I see a kind of a racial animus to undergirding this highly charged anti-socialism rhetoric. So I'll leave it there and look forward to anyone's questions and comments.
Thank you so much for all those provocative and evocative comments, both of you. I guess before we turn it over to the audience, because the questions and answers are rolling in, or questions are rolling in anyway, so please use the Q&A button, everyone. I'm going to turn it back to Peter to see if you want to respond at all or want to react at all to Mike's comments and thoughts, if that's okay.
No, it's great. Well, someone who worked for the Miami Herald for 15 years, including spending a number of years in Europe and going many times to Cuba. I feel some nostalgia for what Michael has been talking about. And that notion, I still remember of, on talk radio, branding things as communist or socialist. I remember the Miami Herald was always known as El Monstruo de la Bahia, right? It's always the great danger. But I think there is a particular resonance to these charges. And I was intrigued by those billboards, that notion of not returning, not voting for what you left behind. I was fascinated by that.
I also wanted to ask you, Peter, if I can put you on the spot, and then we'll open it. I know that I believe that you've reported, did you not, on the fall of communism and all of that at the great moment of the end of the Cold War. If you had any thoughts about, because Michael mentioned them, the degree to which the shadow of the Cold War still serves a very important role in this question.
I think part of it is demographic. There certainly are the connotations that come in Miami, in particular, in South Florida in particular, but certainly with an older generation, those ideas of what we were raised to believe the dangers of communism were, and that is authoritarianism, were very, 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 very powerful. And I did, as you said, I was incredibly lucky. It was kind of a magic carpet ride to be in Europe in 1989, watching each of these dominoes fall. One of the interesting things in retrospect is that, in covering these demonstrations really all through the former Warsaw Pact, were the people who did distinguish between authoritarianism and socialism. Socialism being supportive to your neighbor, but not the one-party state that really became the bogeyman.
That subtlety seems to have gotten lost somewhere along the way. Thank you. All right, why don't we open it up now to questions as they are rolling in. A couple of people have asked around this particular question, which is really to ask each of you for your best definition of what socialism indeed is. 2 or 3 people have asked that. How do you understand, each of you as experts understand the definition of socialism today? You want to go first, Peter, since you're on?
I was hoping Michael would go first. No, it is such a tough thing to define. I think, I mean, just to use Bernie Sanders as an example, or AOC, there's the idea of kind of democratic socialism that is not seizing the means of production, right? We're not talking, a Marxist revolution. We're talking about, and Elizabeth Warren talks about this, I think, extremely clearly, the idea that if you make a lot of money, keep some of it, but invest back. The idea that we all are, as Obama likes to say, our brother's keeper, and that society is built to help the body politic, to help everyone. So it's okay to make a bunch of money, just don't be mean about it.
Yeah, I'm gonna dodge the question effectively, because no, I think it's an important question, obviously, but I think the lesson here is that, and putting my historian's cap on, is that historically there have been varied ways of defining it, right? And I think that's important to acknowledge. And I would even say that in the South Florida context, I mean, what the Cuban Revolution became in terms of the degree of state control of the economy, actually quite different from what Venezuela became, for example, right? Venezuela also continued to have, at least in principle, a kind of a competitive electoral system for a number of years in which Hugo Chavez in particular was in power. Now that's changed recently. So, sometimes the equation too of Cuba equals Venezuela equals Nicaragua. I think it was John Bolton who called these countries last year at some point the troika of tyranny. It begs for more sort of critical analysis about, actually, these are individual countries with individual histories and trajectories, as much as those trajectories are also related to one another. And I would also just say that, my experience talking to Cuban American voters, a lot of times socialism can be maybe less of a trigger word if they have had an experience living somewhere outside of the United States and not in Cuba before they relocate to the United States. So there are Cuban diaspora communities all over the world, pretty much anywhere. But, for example, in Spain, I mean, there is a socialist party in Spain that is sort of part of Spain's democratic tradition, as understood since the end of the Franco era, which gets a lot of flack from the right in Spain, et cetera, and continues to do so. But, is not proposing anything approaching the kinds of models that I think are often referenced implicitly when that word is invoked, right? And so people who have been in Spain can understand that, wait a second, when I was there for 5 years or whatever, I had access to public health care, and it wasn't the sort of slippery slope that it's somehow defined to be. And so if you dig beneath the surface, you can find evidence of, I think, more nuanced understandings of what this word can mean. But it is certainly a flashpoint in local politics here. I think it's used and abused. But I also find myself wondering if we hear most from the people who are loudest rather than the people who are not. So yeah, I'll leave my answer there.
Thank you both of you. Okay, your next question comes from Ian Rand, our colleague at the Wolfsonian and the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab. He asks, what do you think it says about who we are and where we are headed that socialism seems to elicit a much stronger response than authoritarianism? Given contradictions discussed, for example, Obamacare, et cetera, is one political party much stronger than the other in terms of branding? Is this a case of complete denial, he asks. So I don't know, Michael, you want to take that first? We'll go back and forth.
Sure, I can try. I mean, for me, that disconnect may seem new-ish to an American audience, but it is not new for anyone who studied the Latin American Cold War, right? In the Latin American Cold War, very much it was perceived as a zero-sum game, whether you're in Argentina or in Brazil or you're a policymaker in Washington. It makes me think too of Jeane Kirkpatrick's attempt to distinguish between authoritarians, which we can accept because they're in U.S. interests and they're anti-communist, versus totalitarian regimes, right? And I think that's certainly a double standard, and it was at the time in American policymaking. But my point is that in Latin America, there's a long history of this, right? To be anti-communist, anti-socialist does not necessarily mean one is pro-democratic, right? Does not necessarily mean that one doesn't abide by certain authoritarian impulses. So I think if we're experiencing some signs of that, I mean, I would suggest that it's not entirely new in U.S. history either. But again, thinking of this from the South Florida vantage point, it feels oddly familiar to sort of the shape of politics during the Latin American Cold War.
I like that question almost as much as I like the Wolfsonian. Part of it may simply be knowledge. This might be hopelessly naive. As a society, I don't feel like we talk about authoritarianism very much. We don't worry about it, or we haven't historically. Again, that might be a little bit naive. Whereas socialism has been with us in one, at least conceptually, or as an epithet, in some cases as an ideal for a long time. I do think that we are hearing much more about it as we have seen what this president and not just the president, but his attorney general are all about. So it may be a matter of time. If Trump fades away, it's conceivable that the authoritarian tendencies, might also possibly, he says, hopefully ebb away as well. But I think it's too soon to tell. But it's a great thing to pay attention to. And I think finally, that one thing to keep in mind is where the courts go on this, where the newly installed Republican appointed district judges and appellate judges and Supreme Court judges go when it comes to questions of state power.
Absolutely. Thank you both. The next question we have for you is from the director of the Jewish Museum of Florida, our friend Susan Gladstone. I love her question. She says, my Jewish son is marrying his Cuban boyfriend this month with parental approval all around. My son's fiance cannot understand how his Cuban-born parents can be so afraid of socialism, in quotes, that they would vote for someone who would seek to make this marriage illegal. Do you have any words of wisdom I can share? You want to go first, Peter?
Well, I'd rather not. That's a tough one. But what it goes to is the contradictions of, I would say, the Republican Party, not just Donald Trump. I mean, it doesn't make sense. If you try to chart the policies of this administration and its proponent, and its leading voices, as well as the Republicans in the Senate, and then connect them to actual ideas or ideals or any kind of coherent ideology, you get stuck, or I certainly get stuck. It takes somebody smarter than me to figure it out. And I think one answer is to not think too much about it, in a way, is to just recognize it as this unique moment, this unique period that we're in, and turn toward what the parents of the bride and groom are seeing, and that as a certain fundamental decency, divorced from this wild, bizarre moment.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to, Rebecca, you didn't tell me that this was going to be sort of advice columnist, session.
Always everything, Mike.
So, no, I guess this is sort of not an answer, and I apologize for that. But I mean, to me, this just goes to the contradiction of this moment, as Peter would say. And I think this is not the only kind of circumstance in which it manifests. Cubans who are on Obamacare, who are voting for Trump nonetheless, Cubans who have their family on the island, who are really suffering economically the effects of these sanctions, the most recent Trump administration sanctions that they may oppose, but they still sort of believe in Trump's kind of abilities as an economic manager. That idea that Trump is an economic genius has proven remarkably sticky among some audiences. It makes me think, this is another great contradiction. I was talking to a reporter a couple of weeks ago who noted that she had seen in Hialeah, a heavily Cuban part of Miami-Dade County, the storefront of an agency that's a Cuban travel agency, right? Meaning they help people buy tickets to go to Cuba to visit their family on charter flights and things like that. And that's an industry that has been severely restricted, not just because of COVID, but because of new Trump administration rules. And yet this Cuban travel agency that sells travel to Cuba, right, had a Trump sign out front. Right. So is that real? Is that some kind of positioning vis-a-vis one's neighbors in the strip mall? Kind of hard to figure out. But I would say anytime there's signs of fundamental human decency that we can grab onto, and it sounds like your son and his partner are fortunate to count on that from both sides, irrespective of other ideological divides. So I would say focus on that and hold on to that.
Thank you both. We got a couple more questions I think we have time for. They're just coming in. One is from one of my graduate students, Dejan Piekov. He asks, and actually it goes to the Susan's question in some ways about lack of knowledge, I think. Is the lack of informed opinion about socialism not partially the reason for the negative connotation the term carries? What's the role of teachers in the debate around socialism and the Democratic Party? Michael?
Oh, okay, to me. I think it cuts both ways, honestly. I do think that as educators, we have a responsibility to sort of get students to think critically about sort of big loaded words and try to unpack their meanings and understand the different ways that they've been invoked. And part of that work, I think, is, as I highlight to my students in my introductory US history course, like reading about someone like Eugene V. Debs, and whether you agree or disagree, understanding that there is a part of American political history, there is a history of socialism, right? Or invoking that and confronting that. So it's actually not as foreign to sort of American history and DNA as we might be led to believe. But I think it cuts the other way too, because I think people that have particular experiences under governments that exist under this label, socialism or communism or whatever you want to call it, I think people on the left in this country also have a responsibility to take those stories and accounts seriously. These histories are not black or white. It's not about, you can't just pick a camp in my view, right? So what I think has been most distressing about this campaign is the inability that we seem to have to try to have some of those conversations, right? When someone who is sees, a Cuban American or a Venezuelan American sees a Black Lives Matter activist unfurl a banner of Che Guevara, as happened at a couple of protests, rather than seeing that as an opportunity to say, let me tell you sort of my perspective, and at the same point, I want to learn from yours, right? We immediately sort of go to the denunciation, right? And this odd idea, to quote an old disappeared satirical Cuban YouTube character that I used to like, that here in a democracy, we have the right to tell communists to shut up, right? Which is a fundamental contradiction in terms. But yeah, I don't know. We need to get back to a place where rather than seeing enemies, we're trying to understand where people are coming from. Maybe that's hopelessly naive of me too, but I don't know. I hang on to that hope, I guess.
Did you want to answer, Peter? Shall we
just one brief thought about the teaching of it. Socialism, I think we're seeing, is more a label than anything else. It has so many connotations and very few definitions. It's tough it's a struggle. And as the Republicans define socialism, the opposite is freedom and liberty. Right, those are such strong Republican terms. They've run on them for a long time. But one of the things we haven't talked about is the idea of capitalism and understanding more about capitalism, and capitalism as being opposed to socialism in certain ways, right? In conversation with socialism. And I do think, and certainly this may be generational, that there is much more discussion of what capitalism means and what its advantages and disadvantages, what its perils are. And I have to believe, just based on what we've been seeing in recent years, that will intensify, and that will be pretty darn interesting as a subject of teaching and journalism and so on.
I'm gonna have to pick and choose as we're winding down. The next question I will offer is from our Deputy Director here at the Public Humanities Lab, Julio Capo. He says, thanks for this great conversation. Certainly the ambiguity of the term and the capacious way that it is used across place and time permits it to be adopted and co-opted for a number of different causes and certainly campaigns. Like Michael, I noticed the billboards too. It was a road trip back to South Florida en route from North Carolina a few weeks ago. What role do you think the media, in a democracy certainly, but also one very much under attack, to say the least, should play in shaping discourse about both the myths, mistruths about collective-oriented policies? Why are so many hesitant to discuss things like healthcare or education or other services in this manner? Peter, do you want to start? And then I'll look to Michael.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And honestly, it's something that reporters, journalists of all kinds are thinking about pretty much all the time. How do you deal with concepts when one imagines attention spans are short? How does one deal with an administration that makes it up all the time? And we only have to look at the Washington Post's fact checker to see that Donald Trump has misrepresented himself by the Post account 22,000 times since he got to office. I think, as the editor of the Washington Post, Marty Barron, says, we're not at war, we're at work. And the work is to illuminate, to explore, to explain. And that we'd be better off if there were fewer pundits. Easy for me to say. When people think of journalism, they often think of MSNBC, and they think of people with the loudest voices like Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity. They are doing no service, I think, to the body politic when they demonize all kinds of people. And I think the professional quality news organizations just need to keep at it.
Yeah, I would just add, of course, I think media has an incredible role to play here. And I think, this time will go down as an era of some really incredible reporting, notwithstanding the many challenges. But I have to say, from, again, the South Florida vantage point, one of the things that we've been tracking, a number of us have been tracking to try to kind of get a sense of sort of what's driving or what's moving the political needle here, is the shape of the media ecosystem. And I think South Florida is a really unique case because it's not just symptomatic of, people existing in information silos or people getting misinformation on WhatsApp chains and social media feeds. It's compounded in South Florida by a language barrier, and it's compounded by a media ecosystem that kind of exists in and of itself. And I'm not referring to Univision and Telemundo, the kind of national Spanish language media networks that have presence. I'm not referring to El Nuevo Herald, the Spanish version of the Miami Herald. I'm referring to where people seem to be getting their information most are WhatsApp feeds, influencers who have their own sort of YouTube shows that get thousands and thousands and thousands of views, right? That people might have very different perspectives on those people and their personalities, but they all watch them because it's you can't escape it. So how does and I don't like this term, mainstream journalism or just good journalism kind of penetrate that? Right? How do campaigns penetrate that? I think that's something that we're still figuring out. And there's been so much talk about on the campaign side in terms of like micro targeting, right? I mean, one of the things that is a pitfall for both parties with respect to the Latino electorate is treating the Latino electorate not just as a monolith, but even treating the Cuban electorate, to take one example, as a kind of a monolith, right? This is an electorate that is split. You can split and splice along all kinds of levels, generational, right? Someone who migrated from Cuba in 1962 does not have the same life experiences as someone who came in 1995. Similarities, sure, tons, but there's even a kind of a certain language that certain influences are speaking to a more recent migrant community that makes sense to them that to an older demographic it might not, right? And so as news media, how do you deal with that, right? When everybody can kind of find their own channel that really speaks to their own very, very particular experience. I think it's a huge challenge, and I certainly don't have the answer.
Thank you. Shifting gears just a little bit, we have a question from Nathaniel Cadle in our FIU English department and also a WPHL faculty. He asked, what do the panelists make of the use some Democrats have made of the word progressive, which has a long history too, but seems to have much less baggage associated with it? Does it seem like a potentially more effective alternative term to reclaim than socialism? It's also probably a more accurate term, he suggests, but that may be besides the point.
I think one of the main use of progressive may have come when liberal became a bad word, became a dirty word.
Yeah.
You can't be called a liberal, and we'll remember that from the Reagan era, George H.W. Bush era. I certainly hear the word progressive a lot in Wisconsin, right? Home of the progressive movement. And it's certainly been adopted as a way to speak of forward movement, of in fact, progress. And it seems reasonable to me. Although I was struck the other day, if I'm not mistaken, Kamala Harris at the debate was asked, are you a progressive or a socialist? And she focused on the socialist part. But the notion that those are equated is also something we probably don't want to necessarily have in the ecosystem.
Agreed. Michael, thank you.
I'll just add briefly, I mean, I do think in an American political context, progressive is a term that perhaps makes more sense and can serve as an umbrella for a lot of different tendencies that one would find in the Democratic Party. I'd be remiss, however, if I didn't say, having just kind of taught a lecture on the progressive era in US history, that I think progress is also a tricky word, right? Because progress is also in the eye of the beholder. And certainly in history, policies have been implemented in the name of progress that look anything but, right? It is my sort of pitch in that lecture, we talk about sort of the classic reforms of the progressive era, but it's also the era of eugenics, right? Which is very much of a spirit with a kind of faith in science and technology and that, right? So I'm not suggesting that the Democrats should abandon that term entirely. It does strike me as effective, but I think words are always tricky. And I think we have to have some kind of, historical sense of their usage over time.
Thank you. I actually think we're going to end on that because that was such a beautiful way to wrap it up. And I apologize to those whose questions were not answered. I'll make sure the panelists get them and they can decide whether or not they would like to answer them. There are a few that we didn't get to, but I want to thank each of you so much for joining today in what was, I consider, really excellent conversation. So thank you to each of you and to the audience. And we will have a couple of people ask if they could watch this after the fact, and we will turn it into a YouTube and have it on our YouTube channel and share it around. So thank you. That's it. Everyone stay safe. Nice to meet you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Peter. Take care.
Thank you both.
Bye.